Good evening. It is 9:50 p.m., July 27th, 2024, and these are the Tobin Time Travel Talks. Now, stories usually cover the big questions with time travel, like how do I save the ones I love, and how do I prevent the apocalypse, and how do I make a ton of money? But people usually forget a lot of the practical concerns that come with traveling through time. So, today we're going to talk about advice every time traveler should know. Now, while my main lecture series will be getting more and more into the technical aspects of the science of time travel, I'm also going to try and pepper in videos that engage with the practical aspects of time travel, because the YouTube series needs engagement. And because I need clicks, it's going to be a list. Let's say the top 5, not 10. Actually, I can probably only go as high as 8. 8 pro tips for time travelers. Tip number 1, verify your chronoverse. Chronoverse is like a multiverse, but specifically as it refers to time. So it's like all the universes and how they react to time travel. Now, there are 2 basic kinds of time travel. Either you can change the past or you can't. And if you can change the past, you have to figure out whether changes to the past can propagate and grow and be arbitrary, or if the timeline just sort of fixes them. And this all leads us into our 4 basic kinds of chronoverse. Number 1, a single static timeline. Here's the future, here's the past, and maybe you can go back to the past and do stuff, but you can't change anything because it's just one timeline and science says it can't be altered. Number 2, branching timeline. There's one timeline, but if you go back in time, it splits into a new branch timeline. Number 3, pre-existing timelines. There's already a bunch of identical universes spread throughout the multiverse, and when we go back in time, what we're really doing is we're just going from one universe to one of these parallel universes. And number 4, a dynamic timeline. There's one timeline, and if you go back in time, the timeline changes and overwrites itself. So these 2 could be classified as single timeline chronoverses, while these 2 could more or less be classified as multiverses. As a time traveler, it is very important for you to figure out which of these you are in. If you try and change the past in a static timeline, the timeline will fight you, and you will lose and probably explode. With a branching timeline, you may end up leaving your home and never returning, because how do you get back to your original timeline? And of course, in a dynamic timeline, you might just erase yourself from existence. So how do you figure out what kind of chronoverse you're in without the timeline socking you in the gut? Well, we're going to have to use a dangerous and dark technique called science. So we're going to run a few tests. I'm going to gloss over the specifics of how your time machine works in this case, so you'll just have to adapt this test to whatever your existing technology is. Alright, first we're going to take an item. We'll call it item A. In this case, what do I got? I've got a carrot. Okay. And we're going to send it back in time to a safe location. This safe. Now, the first actual step in this test is to check this safe and see if the carrot is already there before we even start. If there's no carrot there, try sending the carrot back. If you can send it successfully, you're probably in some form of multiverse, and you're in the prime timeline. In general, we're going to prefer branching timelines over pre-existing timelines for time travel for a bunch of reasons that warrant their own separate video. If the carrot suddenly appears inside the safe after you send it back in time, then you're in a dynamic timeline, and well, you also apparently have a chrono-resistant memory. Now, if the carrot was in the safe when we first checked at the beginning, it means that you already successfully sent it back in time. Congratulations, time travel! Since the carrot was already sent back, we're going to want to try sending something else back in time. We'll call it item B. And let's see what kind of clip art I have. A hammer. Okay, try sending a hammer back. If your attempt to send it back fails for whatever reason, it could be the timeline fighting you. And this is why we were sending an item back in time, because if it explodes the thing that's being sent back in time, we'd rather it be this hammer than you. So if you fail to send the hammer back in time, try sending that carrot back in time. The carrot you brought with you, not the one that you found in the safe. That leads to a bunch of complications. Again, we'll talk about that in a different video. If sending that carrot back in time goes smoothly now, you've probably got a single static timeline. Now, if you successfully send item B, the hammer, back in time, we're probably looking at a multiverse situation. If, however, item A in the safe suddenly turns into item B, well then we're back to being on a dynamic timeline. And if you find item A and item B both in the safe already, well then we're back to being in a branching timeline, and we're a few different timelines deep already, because those were both sent from different timelines before you. And if you can't even send the carrot back in time, well, maybe you just haven't figured out time travel. Alright, so those tests should help get you on the right track for figuring out what kind of chronoverse you're dealing with. If you want to get any more detail about where you are, you're going to probably need to be able to send a probe or a recording, or maybe even try sending yourself back in time. Tip number 2. When are you? We kind of take it for granted that a time machine will have some kind of gauge on the inside that you can punch in a destination to, and it'll tell you exactly when you are in time. But what if it doesn't? I mean, it can be kind of hard to gauge how far you're traveling through the time stream, I assume. Determining your whenabouts will likely be your first goal. We can call this idea chronometry. Fortunately, every time period the Earth has gone through has been pretty distinctive. By interacting with the native humans, you can probably inquire about the year, or if you don't want to ask them directly, you could probably figure it out by studying the technology, the architecture, or the fashion of the era. But what if this is before humans exist? Well, you could cross-reference the flora and the fauna to narrow down the era. However, that might not narrow it down quite enough. Finding a specific species of dinosaur might narrow it down to between 130 and 65 million BC, and that's a time span of about 65 million years. Even if you see prehistoric humans, you're still in a span of a couple 100,000 years. Now, if you've seen Disney's Wish, you might wonder why we look up at the sky for answers. And no, it's not because you're a star. It's because you can learn a lot about your location in time and space by mapping the constellations. If you have good instruments, you can determine the year from scientific data. Look, here's what the sky looked like in July of 2024 in Los Angeles, and here's what it looked like in August of 1905. They're both very busy, but they're both very unique, like a fingerprint. Up to several million years, you can map the stars to give you the date. However, more than 10,000 years ago, and you'd be better off using radioisotope dating and geochronology. You can determine the age of rocks by their radioactive composition. The oldest rocks are going to be about as old as the Earth. So if you know how old the Earth is when you arrive, you can compare that to how old the Earth is right now in 2024, which is 4.5 billion years. And you can use that to figure out how far back you've gone. Number 3, the locals. Unless you intend to either sneak around or completely stand out in the past, you'll have to learn how to interact with the natives of whatever time period you've arrived in. As such, there are a few topics that you should really consider researching ahead of time. Learning as much about the society you're traveling to is going to be paramount. And even with all the historical resources we have, there's only a certain level of accuracy you can get to without direct exposure. Oh, and don't forget, in addition to those technical rigors, you appeared out of nowhere with no identifying paperwork. You might want to forge some ahead of time. Fortunately, fabrication techniques in the past were pretty weak compared to nowadays, so it might not be too hard to counterfeit older paperwork using today's technology. So actually, there's a lot of ground to cover here, so I'm going to break it up into several smaller points. Number 3 is going to be integrating with the locals and society. Culture evolves. You don't even need to travel through time to see that. Just wandering to different places in your current country could lead to clashes of style, slang, or even language. Right, so like blue jeans and t-shirts weren't considered respectable work attire until the 21st century. Deodorant, as we know it, wasn't really popular until the mid-1900s. Yes, you have to worry about your looks and your smell. Number 4, race. Look, I'm going to be frank here. Race is a thing, and some cultures are not fans of certain races, especially if you're sometime in time. Now, as you can see, I'm a white guy with a STEM background. I'm not going to be your best resource for the history of racism, so I don't have a lot of useful info on this particular topic. I mean, the scientific conception of race is that it is basically non-existent. It's a social construct. So I shouldn't have to explain to you that discriminating against people based on their race is bad. But, I mean, that's never stopped people from characterizing others based on their appearance and origin. I mean, obviously, racism is still a thing today, but people usually consider it to be worse back in time. I mean, a black chrononaut traveling to the antebellum South in America is probably not going to have a good time. Number 5. Language. Of him that written aus tofore, the bocas duele, and we therefore ben taught, of that was written though. John Gower, Confessio Amantis, circa 1390. English as we know it is only about 500 years old. That short passage by John Gower, from 1390, was written in Middle English, the predecessor to Modern English. It's a bit dense, but if you stare at it long enough, you might be able to pull the direct modern translation from it. Of them that wrote before us, the books remain, and we therefore are taught of what was written then. The syntax is a bit flowery, but if you have a strong command of Modern English, you might be able to get by stumbling through Middle English. Now, prior to the Norman Conquest in 1060, you're looking at Old English. And there's more to Old English than adding ye and a few silent e's to words. Fader ora thu the eart on heophonum, sieth the nama yahalgod. If you're clever with language, you might recognize the first word from fader, the Germanic root of father, and the second word looks an awful lot like the word our. And from that, you might correctly guess that these are the opening lines to the Lord's Prayer, also known as the Our Father. Our Father, you who are in heaven, may your name be hallowed. But even knowing precisely what it translates to in modern English doesn't make reading it much easier. I mean, I guess Yahalgod means be hallowed. It is essentially an entirely different language. If you travel any appreciable distance back in time, you will have to study some linguistics in addition to studying the society itself. This is all to say nothing of dialects, accents, and slang. Using the word cool to say something is interesting rather than cold didn't really start until the 1930s. And thanks to the internet, slang evolves faster than ever. Fortunately, resources for understanding it have grown to match, thank you Urban Dictionary, so you can at least look up some slang you don't recognize, making it easier to keep up with. In short, if you're hip to the lingo, you could riz the boodle till they simp for you because you're the goat, but if you're not hella fly, your sus behavior might get you yeeted in the drink for being skill-a-malink. Don't want to wake snakes? Best to just shut pan. No cap. Number 6. Getting aid from the locals. Many time travel scenarios require not only interacting with the locals, but persuading them to help. I mean, there are many ways to get help from people. Even if you don't have access to time, you can still learn how to manipulate people, like a con artist. But chrononauts have a few more options. The most obvious is to convince your helpers to be that you are, in fact, from the future, and that helping you is ultimately in their best interest, because you've seen how things play out, and you know this stuff. And the simplest way to do that is to predict the future. If you predict the future, if you tell someone about some unpredictable upcoming event, and it happens, that lends credence to your story. However, if locals are smart, it would have to be a prediction beyond the bounds of coincidence. Like, predicting who will win the Super Bowl playoffs is, at worst, a 1 in 14 chance. Not likely, but not outside the realms of plausibility. Guessing the precise score or the details of some particular plays puts you a little further outside the realm of what's possible without foreknowledge. But, say, predicting when a large earthquake will hit is really good because we don't yet have a reliable way of predicting them. These all rely on specific events happening on specific dates. They're suitable for convincing any random person that you're from the future, but there are drawbacks. If you arrive early, you might have to wait for that date to arrive. You might also end up dealing with someone who doesn't understand how statistically unlikely your predictions are. Back in 2009, a group of scientists was convicted of manslaughter because they failed to predict an earthquake. The story is actually stupider than you think. So then, the most reliable way to get someone on your side is with actual insider foreknowledge. Preferably, you'll know who you're going to be interacting with before the traversal. Even more preferable is that their older self can help you plan. Everyone has secrets that they haven't told anyone. You should be able to have this colleague part with one of their more mundane secrets, something only they know, not because it's truly private, but because it's so mundane it wasn't worth telling anyone. Think of something like a phrase they thought was funny when they were 6, or a weird bird they saw on their way home one day, or an unusual dream they once had. Think the kinds of questions that a bank might ask if you need to recover your account information. But I mean, don't actually ask those specific questions because those are answers that they've already given someone. And this should be especially easy if the person you're talking to in the past is yourself, because you already know all your secrets. So bringing up a few of these with the young version of whoever you're talking to should be really useful, but if you're desperate, maybe you could try embarrassing them with blackmail. And if all else fails, well, money solves pretty much anything. You can always use time travel to make a ton of money and then use that to hire people to help you. Number 7, diseases. Diseases were different in the past. Not necessarily deadlier or more benign, but certainly different. Our immune systems have adjusted to the evolution of pathogens, and pathogens have in turn evolved to get around our immune systems and medicine in a never-ending arms race. So there are 2 possible issues when it comes to diseases and time travel. People from the past could infect people from the future with a disease we haven't developed medicine or immunity for. With luck, the traveler can return to the present and get treatment. And with foresight, they could retrieve the disease sample before any of them get infected and bring it back to the future for research. If we're especially lucky, it's a disease that already has remedies laying around somewhere. While we're on the topic, food and water in the past might be an issue. The safety standards weren't all that great in the past, even relatively recently. So there is a danger of botulism, dysentery, lead poisoning, all sorts of terrible things. It's a common misconception that medieval societies drank alcohol-laden beverages because the alcohol disinfected them. However, that's not the case. Making potable water is actually basically as simple as filtering it and boiling it. So the other option for diseases is that time travelers could infect people in the past with diseases from the future that they have no way to combat. If we brought an especially virulent modern disease like COVID-19 back in time, we might be looking at another Black Death. And even common germs that have evolved with us could be a lot stronger and deadlier than they were in the past. In fact, time travel wasn't even necessary for one culture to devastate another with foreign diseases. Early American settlers wiped out native populations with smallpox. In addition to several other diseases, but smallpox is the most well known. Bringing vaccines with you can mitigate the risks to varying degrees, but herd immunity would be nearly impossible without a large-scale operation in the past. Unfortunately, there's not really a quick fix here. Your best bet is probably going to be to self-isolate before time travel so you can give your body time to kill all the diseases that are already in your system, and then for good measure, take some blood tests before you go back in time. Fortunately, if the destination is pre-human, there will likely not be many diseases that can harm you. Germs generally evolve to attack specific species. Number 8. What to pack for time travel. So what all should you be bringing on your journey? Now, that probably depends on how much space you have in your time machine. You can start by planning your packing as if you're going on an extended camping trip. Take emergency supplies, shelter, food, etc. If you intend to stick around for a while, consider bringing a computer and a solar charging device to keep it powered. As of this writing, you can also download the entire text of Wikipedia in just a few gigabytes. Or you could also include all the images too for under 100 gigabytes. That's all the information you really need to plan for any upcoming socio-political changes, natural disasters, or if you want to invent any technology before their actual inventor gets around to it. There's an idea. You might also want to download some books or movies for leisure while you're at it. Who's counting gigabytes? Don't forget currency. Chances are that the paper money and coins you have will be completely useless, even just a few decades ago. So you can't bring those. One option would be to go back a few years at a time and keep exchanging your cash for older cash, but that could get really tedious if you have to go back really far. Your best bet might be to acquire some small amount of money in the target time period and then use a getting rich with time travel scheme to multiply that. You could try bringing something back in time to sell for cash. That would be a good way to seed your funds, but what would be worth money in the past? There's always future technology. That'd be extremely valuable, but its very existence would raise a lot of questions and cause major changes to the timeline before you can do anything. If you go back far enough, then salt, sugar, and basic kitchen spices were quite valuable. Between 1825 and 1886, aluminum was more valuable than gold. Speaking of which, if you know ahead of time the right locations, you could prospect for gold. Now, as usual, the ultimate solution is to research the destination era and location and stock up on whatever is useful for that period. And that was your top 8 pro tips for time travelers. So that brings us to the end of today's lesson. If you want to support the series, or if you're ready to dive into the nitty-gritty of time travel, consider purchasing the Chronoversal Compendium on Amazon, or follow the Ingram Spark link in the description for a special discount on the hardcover. There's also some Chronarch Butterfly merch available on TeePublic and Redbubble. That's all for now. See you yesterday.